Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I talk once again with Lee Moore, a former PhD student at the University of Oregon, to talk about his forthcoming book, China: The Stories Behind the Story. Lee, thanks for coming back on the What is Asia podcast.
Nikota, thanks for having me. It's a delight.
You're working on a book which is expected to come out, I guess, in the next couple of years, called China: The Stories Behind the Story. So can you just start by telling us, what are you aiming to demonstrate in this book? And if you could also talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book, because for those in the audience, I'll let you know, Lee is really preaching to the choir here in terms of his message in this book.
Yeah. So the book is essentially trying to, since your podcast is directed towards a more academically educated audience, I'll use the term intervention, if that's okay. It's an intervention both into the media and into kind of China studies in academia. So there have been plenty of books on China done both by journalists and by academics. The problem with what journalists do is that oftentimes, not always, but quite frequently, they don't have a deep knowledge of China. So I'm thinking particularly of, I'm just going to call out names, China Interrupted by Michael Schumann. He, I think, writes for The Atlantic. He writes this long book that in some ways has quite a bit of interesting information. I actually learned quite a bit from the book, but he doesn't speak Chinese. He doesn't read Chinese, I should say. In his bibliography, he makes it clear that he's not actually looking at any Chinese language sources. Apparently, he's having folks translate stuff. And he makes this really long journalistic-y argument about he's going to present history as the Chinese see it. But I kind of wonder, how do you do that if you don't speak Chinese? So that's just a prime example of kind of one of the ways journalists, in trying to explain China, don't quite do it justice. Now, academics, they go the other direction. Academics explain the specifics of China. They like talk about the minutiae of China, and that's kind of what academics are supposed to do, but they can't ever bring it back and speak more broadly to a general audience. I am the co-host of the Chinese Literature podcast. One of the things we've tried to do since we launched in 2016 is take China, and specifically Chinese literature, but we like to think of ourselves explaining kind of Chinese culture, Chinese history, lots of different elements of China, to a broader audience. And academics have a tendency to lace everything they say with references to Foucault and other philosophers that nobody gets. I like Foucault, but there comes a point where you have to drop the Foucault references. So what I'm trying to do with this book is navigate between that Scylla and Charybdis. I'm trying to not be too shallow, which I think a lot of the journalistic works on China are too shallow. And I'm trying not to be too academic-y and incomprehensible to anyone who doesn't have a master's degree in something related to Asia.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there needs to be more people in the academic field writing popular histories and connecting that bridge between general audiences and the academic world. What kinds of topics are you wanting to cover specifically in this book, and why choose the specific topics that you've chosen?
So one of the framing devices that I have for this book is that I'm looking at the news stories that journalists are covering and trying to give the full backstory, including literature and history, that because of that, I'm looking at things that have been in the news recently. So, I mean, we're recording this in the beginning of September 2022, and I almost said September 2020, September 2022, and if you think about like the big stories, Xinjiang. So we've got an export ban that Congress has recently announced. Taiwan, we're only a couple of weeks out from Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The Chinese economy is kind of very much a matter of concern. So the topics that I'm looking at are those: Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and I'll have a section on the Chinese economy. Those are kind of what I'm thinking of right now, and possibly a section on the migration of Chinese folks to the United States.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind when I think about your ambition to sort of, I guess, reach across the aisle, that has other connotations, but I think we can sort of use it here to talk about an aisle that divides the general audiences and in the academic world. But
the hoi polloi from the academics.
Yeah, exactly. But China is a particularly tricky one. And I remember I was speaking to a professor some years ago who had said that, before 9/11, the Middle East sort of, to general audiences, seemed like this innocuous topic. Like, oh, okay, you studied the Middle East, that's cool. And then 9/11 happens. And suddenly the way people understand the Middle East in their minds was totally reframed. Suddenly everyone became an expert on Iraq, on Afghanistan, and scholars of the Middle East, particularly the ones who study the areas where the U.S. had been engaged in war, almost not only had to teach that part of the world, but unteach that part of the world. And I feel like in the China field, especially since the ascension of Xi Jinping and, especially since COVID, China scholars have really had to go on that same sort of path of unteaching China in many ways. So how, in your mind, can scholars do a better job of unteaching China? And we'll just start there, but I have a follow-up question after that.
I think one of the ways you unteach China is you tell stories. So what I'm trying to do with this book is use narratives. Humans learn through stories. That's actually something that has kind of become an evolutionary adaptation. I'm not a biologist or an anthropologist or whatever, but my understanding based on recent research into human evolution is that stories are actually an evolutionary adaptation by which humans learn. And if you're teaching someone without stories, I think you're doing them a disservice. And a lot of the scholarship on China has been done without stories. I think the example you brought up of the Middle East and 9/11 is particularly important, because if you look at what the results of that were, I think that the teaching of the Middle East and in academia to the general public before 9/11 and the teaching of China today has some analogs. You have academics who are obsessed with precision over narrative, and you really risk losing people. And if you lose people in the general public, and the general public has no idea of what's going on in the Middle East, you can see the consequences of that for American foreign policy. I think that no one knew anything about Iraq, and so they took these baseless claims pushed by certain members of the Bush administration, and we had this huge debacle in Iraq, partially because people didn't know enough to push back. People in the general public didn't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. People in the American government didn't know the difference on that. And I think that one of the things that we need to do better as Asianists, as scholars in the China field, as we are increasingly coming, I hope we don't come into conflict with China, but as we increasingly have testy relationships with China, we as scholars in the U.S. need to do a better job of finding ways to explain China so that the general public doesn't do the equivalent of mixing up a Sunni and a Shia, right? Like, we need to be able to explain what China is about, and the average person needs to know the difference between Confucianism and Taoism as much as they can kind of understand the difference between Protestants and Catholics.
One thing that's been encouraging to me about doing this podcast and seeing other people do China-related podcasts is it does seem like there are more China scholars now, both in sort of the younger generation, but also in the older generation, who are increasingly becoming more willing to sort of get out into the media spotlight. And I think that's great, because then that's a source of, reliable information that's sort of in a sea of questionable information about China. But I wonder if we
part of the reason is because of people like you doing this podcast, right? Like, you're out there putting good information out that hopefully is countering the disinformation or the bad information. I don't know how you put it.
Well, and hopefully my small needle in the haystack is reaching someone of some political power and importance, and maybe yours is too, because your podcast is far larger than mine. So maybe, who knows? Maybe the president's listening to you, and you're making that small impact.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. But, I almost wonder if in the China field we should go further in this. And it's been an opinion of mine for a while that China scholars take a required media communications class to learn how to speak. For example, if you're invited on Fox or CNN, to know how to make your point within 30 seconds, not necessarily to make a talking point, but to know how to concisely make your point in a way that a large swath of people are going to be able to understand. I guess I wanted to get your take on that. And then, as an extension of that question, it's another opinion of mine, and I've made this comment on other episodes, that, if you think about astronomy, the first person that comes to your mind is Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you think about zoology, the first person you think of is David Attenborough. It's my opinion that I think in the China field, or in the Asian studies field more broadly, we need a Neil deGrasse Tyson. We sort of need a spokesperson. Other people have said there's problems with that, because then it's, you have one person who's sort of determining the narrative for the general public. And of course, there are some dangers with that. But I guess getting your take on the sort of media communications thing, and then the sort of having a spokesperson thing that I've said. What are your takes on that?
So the first point I'll take, I definitely think that we need to be doing a better job of explaining ourselves in a kind of media that is consumed by the general public. Absolutely. Whether or not it's like a required course or not, I haven't thought about that. I think that there could be some positives to that. I think that that could have. I just don't know. I'm skeptical of how useful that will be, because I think all of these things that bureaucracies cook up oftentimes are not as useful as they claim they will be. But certainly, in terms of your objective, I agree 100% wholeheartedly that that's a great idea. I wonder, though, if it's not our fault as educators. I wonder if this is a result of our fault as educators. Explaining what you're doing in 30 seconds, that doesn't seem to be something that you should just need to do with the media. It seems to be like every time you go home for Thanksgiving, every time you go home or talk to someone on the street, even when you're talking with fellow academics. Someone who's doing Song Dynasty economics needs to be able to explain to someone who does Qing Dynasty military history what they're doing. And I have often encountered folks in academia who can't do that. And as someone who is an academic, if I go, I don't really care what you're talking about. Like, you've already droned on for 5 minutes about something that I know nothing about. Then how are you ever going to explain the importance of what you do to a broader public? You just can't. In terms of having a spokesperson, one spokesperson, multiple spokespeople, I think that it would actually be great if we could have anyone who could sort of do that. Certainly, I would be happy to take on that role. I don't know if I'm good enough or not. Actually, I take that back. I don't think I'm good enough. But I'm happy to try and fail at that. But I honestly, like, the more the merrier, right? Like, why not have 4 or 5 different spokespeople representing different perspectives on Asia as Asia and China specifically become increasingly important to America's diplomacy, economy, all that kind of stuff. Why not have lots of people who are speaking to that and lots of different diverse perspectives, right?
I ideally, as a scholar of China, as someone who's writing this book about the stories behind the stories behind the story in China, how do you hope people will come to view understanding China as a result of reading your book? What sort of ways do you hope they'll change their actions or their views or their words toward China in both their daily life? Perhaps if maybe a politician is reading this, how do you hope that they would act differently in the way that they vote when it comes to an issue having to do with China? What sort of actionable responses do you hope are going to come out of a book like this and books like this that are being written by other scholars?
So let me give you a roundabout answer to that question. One of the chapters that I've already written a draft of, and I'm redrafting, is on Chinese economics, and it looks at this discussion that's happening in the U.S. now, and particularly in American media. And there are some folks who say, who talk about China as if it's a special place, as if the laws of economics, rules of economics, whatever you want to say, don't apply. I try and question that. And I go back to different points in Chinese history, the Great Leap Forward, the Song Dynasty, and the Xinfa, the new reforms of Wang Anshi, and his fight with Su Dongpo and Sima Guang, and others. And then I look at the reforms under Han Wudi and others in terms of economic reforms. And I use the labels conservative and liberal, which are kind of problematic because you are applying words that are used today in contemporary American discussions of politics and taking them and applying them to a totally different time when the issues were quite different. And in one of my earlier drafts, I was criticized for that. I actually have doubled down on that, and I'm using those terms. And as I'm redrafting the chapter or chapters, I use the terms conservative and liberal. And the reason I decided to continue with that is because I want to make Song Dynasty economic policy relevant to today's American reader. And the only way you can do that is by putting things in a framework that folks understand. does it actually, like, are the terms conservative and liberal like 100% precise in terms of the issues that we deal with today in American politics, and how liberals and conservatives come down on that, and how the conservatives and liberals in the Song dynasty came down on different issues? No, they're not. It's an analogy. But to make something relevant, you have to use analogies, particularly if it's something so unfamiliar that the average American readership has absolutely no clue of what you're talking about. The only way you can do that, the only way you can make it relevant, is by using terms that are meaningful and by framing it in a way that you go, actually, this is something that is not all that different from American politics. So to answer that was a really long roundabout way of getting back to your question. What do I want policymakers to do differently after they read this book? What do I want a general readership to do differently than once they read my book? I don't actually have policy outcomes that I want them to change. It's not like I personally don't have something that I want them to go like, oh, we're definitely not going to do this thing that Song Dynasty liberals did, or we're definitely not going to do this thing that Song Dynasty conservatives did. What I want them to see is that China applies to their life, and Chinese history, Chinese culture is relevant to them, and I want them to have to feel a joy in reading about Chinese history. I don't want it to be some abstract, distant thing that they've never heard of. I want them to go, this applies to me. I understand how it applies to me, and then make decisions based off that. So it's not so much policy outcomes that I want to change, but just kind of, I want people to think of China as relevant to their thinking, and to, in the same way that American politicians will go back to stuff that happened in the Roman Republic or stuff that happened in Greece. I want them to go back to episodes that happened in Chinese history and be like, so this is the thing that happened here, and this is how this helps me think about this problem that I'm facing today. Thomas Ricks just wrote a book called First Principles about how the founders of the U.S. thought about classical Europe, Greece, and Rome, and how that affected their thinking. I would like, after people reading my book, for them to come to China in a similar way.
I have just a couple more questions before we go. The first one, maybe it sounds a little bit silly, but I think it's something that's still worth asking anyway. You know, if you had talked to someone just a couple years ago prior to the pandemic, they would have said, you know, China is becoming more and more integrally tied to the US in terms of issues of politics, economics, society, and whatnot. But recently I've started to hear comments from political pundits, and just from what I'm seeing and hearing online, who knows how credible they are, but it's worth noting that a lot of people are starting to say, like, oh, you know, China's in its waning days, it's flatlining economically, it's becoming like Japan. Some people are going so far to say is the whole thing might come tumbling down. In terms of thinking about the relevance of this book, do you think that in a post-pandemic world where China, as of this recording, is still locked down to the world, do you think China is actually going to become less relevant, or perhaps even more relevant to the U.S. In the nearby future? Looking at it from the perspective of someone in the general audience who's looking at your book, wondering whether or not they should pick it up. You know, is China actually going to be relevant to them in the years to come?
More, absolutely. It will become more relevant. I don't think China is going away. You know, China's economy is flatlining, but I would not count it out by any stretch of the imagination. China has become the 700-pound gorilla in the global economy. I mean, that said, I think America is the 900-pound gorilla, but still, China is incredibly relevant in terms of business, economics, diplomacy. They're not the PRC is not going away. And I think that if anything, China is likely to be more relevant, particularly to an American readership in 2024. I think that we're going to see them coming back, see discussions of China coming back in the presidential election of 2024. If you look at what happened in Australia's recent election, China was front and center. The conservatives claimed that China was controlling the Labor Party. The Labor Party still won, but it did so only because it avowed that they essentially they were skeptical of the Chinese, or specifically the PRC and the CCP, as the conservatives were. China's role in Australian politics has never been greater. I think that Australia is likely to be a kind of a forerunner of American politics in the 2024 election, not seeing the importance of China disappearing at all.
And finally, before we go, I'd sort of made the vague comment at the top of this conversation that maybe in the next few years we'll see the book come out. Can we get a better sense from you of maybe when someone in the general readership might actually be able to hold a physical copy of your book?
I'm shopping the book around now with book proposals to literary agents and publishers. My hope is to have it out early in 2024. In time for the presidential election. That's the plan right now, but hopefully it will be out by then.
Lee, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Nikota, thanks so much for having me again.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NikotaDefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.